Folks, I have been, some consider, ranting and raving about how corrupt and how un-American and how anti-citizens' rights the Republican Party is. And I came across two stories that I want to share with you. One of them out of Rolling Stone magazine, or rollingstone.com, and the other basically out of I can't remember the name of the periodical. I believe it's The Nation. Yeah, it's The Nation. And these two stories taken separately might not seem to you like that much of a big deal. But if you consider both stories together, they basically give you a super strong idea of the morals of the Republican Party and how much the Republican Party will go to any means possible in order to retain power, in order to try to negate the power of the people in determining our own destinies. Now, the first story, which is out of Rolling Stone, is an article that is titled, "How the GOP Rigs Elections." And I'm going to read the story to you in its entirety. How the GOP rigs elections. With a combination of gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and dark money, Republicans have tipped the political scales in their favor. Will it be enough to keep Democrats from claiming victory in 2018? On a quiet, tree-lined street in Racine, Wisconsin, in a neighborhood known as the Danish Village for its Scandinavian ancestry, sits a two-story white house with a large American flag hanging from the porch and a pro-police "We Back the Badge" sign in the yard. It's the home of Republican State Senator Van Waggard, W-A-N-G-G-A-A-R-D, a 65-year-old former cop whose blonde hair resembles that of Dennis the Menace. Two houses to the south, Waggard's State Senate District, the 21st, abruptly cuts off to exclude the rest of the largely Democratic neighborhood. This used to be one of the state's most competitive state Senate districts, encompassing all of the rectangular-shaped Racine County, a 50-50 mix of urban and rural communities in southeast Wisconsin. But since the GOP gained control of the state's government in 2010 and redrew the legislative maps, the district is now shaped like a horseshoe, pulling in the Republican countryside of Racine and Kenosha counties while excluding heavily Democratic areas except for the block where Waggard lives. It's a prime example of how a party in power chose a district for their guy, says John Lehman, a Democrat who represented the 21st district before Waggard. To say that Republicans are facing a toxic political environment heading into the 2018 midterm elections would be a massive understatement. Donald Trump is the most unpopular president at this stage of his term in modern American history. Just 3 in 10 Americans have a favorable view of the Republican Party, and Democratic voters' enthusiasm to vote in 2018 tops Republican voters by 17 points. But because of sophisticated gerrymandering, Republicans who should be vulnerable, like Waggard, have been seen as untouchable. It's more challenging than it should be because of the way the districts are drawn, says Jenny Dye, who works for Democrats in Wisconsin State Senate. Waggard is among 11 Republican state senators up for re-election in 2018, but no one has stepped forward to challenge him yet. The gerrymandering in Wisconsin, which experts call among the most extreme in U.S. history, is but one part of Republicans' stealth plan to stay in office. Since Governor Scott Walker and the Republican legislature took power, they've also introduced some of the country's harshest voting restrictions, passing laws that make it harder for Democratic-leaning constituencies to register to vote and cast ballots. At the same time, the state has become the Wild West of dark money, according to Lisa Graves, a senior fellow at the Madison-based Center for Media and Democracy, with Republican politicians like Walker raising unprecedented sums from billionaire donors to finance their campaigns. All three of these things have to be seen as part of a whole, says Eric Holder, Barack Obama's Attorney General, who founded the National Democratic Redistricting Committee in 2016 to challenge Republican gerrymandering efforts. Unregulated dark money combined with these voter ID laws, combined with gerrymandering, is inconsistent with how our nation's system is supposed to be set up. American citizens ought to be concerned about the state of our democracy. We could end up with a system where a well-financed minority that has views inconsistent with the vast majority of the American people runs this country. Most immediately, a beleaguered Republican Party tainted by Trump could still retain majorities in 2018 and 2020. It's not a level playing field, says Tom Perez, head of the Democratic National Committee. There are millions of people whose votes effectively don't count. And as a measure of the GOP's ability to maintain a political advantage, despite widespread public opposition to its policies, look no further than Wisconsin. We've been under a counter-revolution here for the past 6 years, says Matt Rothschild, executive director of the Wisconsin Democratic Campaign, which tracks the influence of money in politics. Walker has urged other states to follow his model. Reactionary politics is a big Wisconsin export now. In the summer of 2011, soon after activists occupied the rotunda of the Wisconsin State Capitol to protest Walker's bill stripping public employee unions of collective bargaining rights, Republican members of the legislature visited the offices of Michael Best and Friedrich, the party's go-to law firm. The GOP was in control of the state's redistricting process for the first time since the 1950s, and Republicans were shown to the map room, where their aides were drawing new political districts in secret following the 2010 census. The legislators signed confidentiality agreements pledging not to discuss the work with anyone, even though the redistricting was financed with taxpayer funds. Public comments on this map may be different than what you hear in this room, read the talking points distributed to GOP legislators. Ignore the public comments. The new maps had titles like aggressive to describe how they favored Republicans. The maps we pass will determine who's here 10 years from now, a legislative aide told the Republican caucus. We have an opportunity to draw these maps that Republicans haven't had in decades. On July 11, 2011, the maps were introduced to the legislature. No Democrat had seen them before they were released. There was one public hearing 2 days later, and the reshaped districts were approved the next week on a party line vote. This looks fair to me, said Weingart to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. I don't have anything jumping out at me. Weingart, however, declined to comment for the article that I'm reading from. Yet his district has been radically transformed from a 50-50 swing district to one that favored a Republican by 16 points. Racine and Kenosha counties, which border each other, have been separate state Senate districts, which made sense. The counties have their own newspapers, school districts, and board of supervisors. Both districts were politically competitive. For the citizens, their vote really mattered, said Lehman, the former state senator. That's the way it ought to be in every single district in America. Republicans took the districts and flipped them vertically, combining Racine and Kenosha counties for the first time in 100 years. As a result, Republicans gained at least 2 seats in the state legislature. Weingard's new red district encompassed the sprawling GOP suburbs and farmland, with Democratic voters concentrated in the urban centers of the two counties. Lehman, a retired public school teacher in Racine, represented the 21st district from 1996 to 2010. He lived a few blocks from Weingart and used to teach at the same high school where Weingart was sometimes stationed as an off-duty cop. Weingart defeated him in 2010 by 3,000 votes, but after Weingart voted for Walker's anti-union legislation, Lehman beat him in a recall election in 2012. By then, the new district lines had been drawn by Republicans, but they didn't take effect until after the recall, which put Lehman in an awkward position of winning an election in his competitive old district, but serving a new, deeply Republican one. "I tried to serve the district, but it was like a foreign land," he said. On a brisk afternoon in late November, Lehman took me on a tour of the 21st. We departed from the Racine neighborhood where he and Weingart lived and drove down narrow country roads to the far southwest corner of the district, passing old farms, new McMansions, and small towns with yard signs that read, "Keeping Christ in Christmas." After an hour, we reached the resort town of Twin Lakes, population 6,000, near the Illinois border. Unlike Racine, which has a large black population and votes Democratic, Twin Lakes is overwhelmingly white and Republican. Rance Priebus, the former White House chief of staff to Donald Trump, used to be its village attorney. When Lehman spoke at a Memorial Day parade in Twin Lakes throwing candy to kids, few people knew who I was, he says. When he had listening sessions in the district's rural areas, nobody showed up. "If you lived out here, would you pay any attention to anything that happened in Racine?" Lehman asked. In 2014, Lehman decided to run for lieutenant governor instead of trying to win re-election in his new district. "It was unwinnable for a Democrat," he said. Weingart ran again and won by 23 points. Most of the state legislature's Republican majority has been just as secure. In 2012, Obama carried Wisconsin by 7 points, a miracle, and Democratic legislative candidates received 51.4% of the statewide vote, but Republican candidates won 60 of 99 seats in the State House. Under the Republican map, the number of safe GOP seats in the 132-member legislature increased from 55 to 69, and the number of swing districts decreased from 24 to 13. It's a practically foolproof system. No matter what happened nationally, Republicans would maintain control of state politics. This isn't just a problem in Wisconsin. It's a problem all across the country as far as gerrymandering is concerned, and I did a video regarding this previously. Following the 2010 elections, Republicans had full control of the redistricting process for state legislatures and the U.S. House seats in 21 states, compared with 8 states for Democrats. Republicans now hold as many as 22 additional House seats because of gerrymandering, according to an analysis by the Associated Press, nearly the same margin as the 24 seats Democrats need in order to take back the House. During the 2012 elections, Democratic House candidates won 1.4 million more votes nationally than Republicans, but the GOP won 33 more seats. Of course, Democrats have also engineered gerrymandering to gain partisan advantage, including in blue states like Illinois and Maryland. But in the past decade, Republicans have turned the manipulation of political lines into an art form. Democrats in Wisconsin went to court to contest these efforts. In November 2016, a federal court panel surprisingly struck down Wisconsin's state legislative maps as an unconstitutional political gerrymander that was intended to burden the representational rights of Democratic voters by impeding their ability to translate their votes into legislative seats. Republicans appealed to the Supreme Court, which will rule on the landmark case Gill versus Whitford this year. The justices have the chance to outlaw partisan gerrymandering not just in Wisconsin, but nationwide. For the first time in American history, it would be a really big deal for the court to say there's limits to how far you can go when it comes to partisan gerrymandering, holders said. Gerrymandering the state's political boundaries isn't the only method Republicans in Wisconsin use to prevent Democrats from winning elections. On Election Day 2016, Teresa Townsend, a 24-year-old massage therapist, went to cast her ballot at a library in Milwaukee's Washington Park, a working-class, predominantly African-American neighborhood northwest of downtown. Voting was important to Townsend. I try my hardest to make change where I can, and I feel like voting is one of the things that helps you make a change, she says. And she was eager to vote against Trump, whom she calls a waste of space for our country. But this was Wisconsin's first major election that required people to show government-issued photo ID to vote. Townsend, who was registered in Wisconsin, had misplaced her driver's license before the election. She brought her student ID from Milwaukee Area Technical College, a copy of her energy bill, and a picture of her driver's license on her phone. None were accepted as a valid voting ID under the law. So that means a picture of your ID, as far as voting is concerned, is no good. But a picture of ID, if you're stopped by law enforcement for a violation, is proper ID. Yeah, go figure. Instead, poll workers gave her a provisional ballot. It would only count if she went to the DMV to get a new license and then to the Board of Elections to confirm her vote within 72 hours of Election Day. How the hell do you get a new driver's license with a picture on it, by the way, within 72 hours? Impossible. Anyway. But Townsend worked full-time and couldn't get away. Having voted for Obama in 2012, she found herself unable to cast a ballot in 2016. I showed them so many different versions of me, she said. I felt like they were trying their hardest for me to not vote. Townsend was not alone. After the legislature passed a law in May 2011, a federal court found that 9% of registered voters in the state did not have the required forms of ID. Black voters who overwhelmingly support Democrats in Wisconsin were 50% more likely than whites to lack such IDs, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Up to 11% of Americans do not possess government-issued photo IDs, including 25% of African American voters. We see these restrictions sprouting up like mushrooms in battleground states with large minority populations, says Dale Ho, director of the Voting Rights Project at the ACLU, which challenged Wisconsin's law in court. Laws that require you to have a particular ID to cast a ballot disproportionately impact certain groups of voters, particularly poorer voters who don't have the same access to documentation and IDs as the rest of us. Republicans claim the voter ID law was needed to stop widespread voter fraud. After Weingart lost the recall by 819 votes, his lawyer said election officials in Racine had used procedures that would make Fidel Castro blush. Republicans claimed that voter registrations were found in a dumpster, poll books were unsigned, and union members were bused from Michigan to vote illegally. Anyone who argues that we do not need voter ID either wants to conceal these potential fraudulent activities or hasn't been paying attention, Weingart, who co-sponsored the law, told Vice News. Yet no evidence of fraud turned up when the county sheriff and district attorney, both Republicans, launched a month-long investigation, nor did Republicans present any cases of voter impersonation when the law was challenged in court. The law, initially blocked for violating the Voting Rights Act, was reinstated in 2014 by a panel of conservative judges. Voter fraud is a very small problem in Wisconsin and nationally. According to one major study from 2000 to 2014, there were only 31 cases of voter impersonation out of more than 1 billion votes cast. Studies show that the kind of fraud that these laws are supposedly enacted to prevent happens less frequently than Americans being struck by lightning, says Ho. Oh, and just so that you know, those 31 cases, the majority of those cases occurred here in Texas and I believe in Illinois. And wouldn't you know it, it wasn't people who were impersonating other people to vote Democratic. It was people trying to impersonate other people trying to vote Republican. So the problem was a Republican one, if you even want to call it a problem, when you're talking about 31 out of a billion. Even so, Republicans have admitted their ID laws help prevent Democrats from voting. On the night of Wisconsin's 2016 primary, Glenn Grothman predicted a Republican would carry the state in November, saying, "I think Hillary Clinton is about the weakest candidate the Democrats have ever put up, and now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference." Excuse me. The Republican strategy worked as intended. Wisconsin ranked second in the nation in voter participation in 2008 and 2012, but in 2016 saw a 3.3% drop in turnout, the largest decrease in voting of any state other than Mississippi. Roughly half of it occurred in Milwaukee. In black neighborhoods which heavily favored Clinton, turnout decreased by 23%. Overall, black turnout dropped by 19% in Wisconsin in 2016 compared with 2012, more than 4 times the national decline among black voters, according to a report by the Center for American Progress. So, right after the election, you heard a bunch of ill-informed people that claimed that Clinton lost the election because of a lack of black voter turnout. And that might have been a contributing factor, but it wasn't what I would call conscious effort not to vote. It was Wisconsin doing everything it could to stop people of color, particularly black people, from voting. And here is your evidence. Anyway, after the election, registered voters who didn't cast a ballot in Milwaukee and Madison, the state's 2 most Democratic areas, were asked why. 1 in 10 non-voters said they were blocked or deterred by the state's ID law, according to a University of Wisconsin study. That meant up to 23,000 people in 2 counties alone didn't show up, at least in part because of the ID requirement, almost the exact same number of votes by which Trump won the state. Up to 45,000 people were prevented from voting statewide. African Americans who voted for Clinton over Trump by an 88-8 margin were 3 times more likely than whites to be kept from the polls. Thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of otherwise eligible people were deterred from voting by the ID law, said University of Wisconsin political science Kenneth Mayer. That's why Republicans passed the law in the first place. In a closed-door meeting of the Senate Republican caucus in 2011, State Senator Mary Lazick argued in favor of the bill, saying, "We got to think about what this could mean for the neighborhoods around Milwaukee and the college campuses." According to a Republican aide who attended the meeting, 2 other state senators were giddy and politically frothing at the mouth over the bill. Wisconsin made it particularly difficult for certain Democratic-leaning constituencies to comply with the law. Because of how it is written, on 3 of 13 4-year schools in the University of Wisconsin system had compliant student IDs, and just 7 of 23 private colleges. Nor did the state adequately reach out to the groups most at risk of being disenfranchised. Wisconsin ran ads about the law in 52 movie theaters across the state, but not a single ad in Milwaukee, where 70% of the state's African Americans live. Since the 2010 elections, 23 states have adopted new voting restrictions such as ID laws, cutting early voting, adding new barriers to voter registration, purging the voting rolls, and disenfranchising ex-felons, all of which hurt Democrats more than Republicans. It's no accident that these laws were passed after the election of the first black president in 2008, who was ushered in by the record turnout of African Americans, Hispanic, Asian Americans, and young voters. If you look at the timing of these laws in relation to the changing demographics of the electorate, it can't be just a coincidence. says the ACLU's Mr. Ho. In 2013, the Supreme Court compounded the problem by ruling that states with long histories of voting discriminations no longer had to clear new election rules with the federal government. That made the 2016 election the first presidential contest in more than 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It tarnishes the promise that we made to Americans that when they step into the ballot box, they're going to be free of racial discrimination, says Myrna Perez, director of the Voting Rights and Election Project of the Brennan Center for Justice. Across the country, from Arizona to Ohio to North Carolina, people had trouble voting as a result. According to a study by MIT, an estimated 16 million people, 12% of all voters, experienced at least one problem voting in 2016. There were more than 1 million lost votes because eligible voters didn't have the right ID, or they encountered long lines at the polls or couldn't register. Trump won the election by a combined total of 78,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Since Trump's election, Republicans have accelerated their efforts to make it harder to vote. The president's whopping lie that millions voted illegally in 2016 led to the creation of a Presidential Advisory Commission on election integrity, which was run by figures such as Kansas State Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who had repeatedly spread false claims about voter fraud in order to pass policies that restrict access to the ballot. Just so that you know, if you're not aware of it, that the Presidential Advisory Commission was disbanded because one of the Democratic members turned around and filed a lawsuit because the commission never met. And he wanted to know what the heck was going on. So Trump disbanded the commission, but the lawsuit is still going forward, so they want to see what the hell happened. The commission, that's what I get. I should have just kept reading. The commission was abruptly disbanded by Trump in early January after facing 15 federal and state lawsuits for violating a wide range of privacy and transparency laws stemming from the commission's unprecedented request for sensitive data information from all 50 states. Despite the setback, Trump's Justice Department has reversed the Obama administration's opposition to voter ID laws and voter purging, and Republican-controlled state houses have passed more new voting restrictions in 2017 than in 2016 and 2015 combined. It's not a coincidence that states that were badly gerrymandered during the last round of redistricting, like Texas, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, also passed some of the most oppressive voter ID laws, says Holder. They are two parts of the same attack by the Republicans. They have systematically attacked America's right to vote. And as I had stated in a previous video, all of the states that I just mentioned have been taken to court and have lost lawsuits and either must appeal, which a bunch of them are doing, to the Supreme Court, or being forced to redraw in a more fair manner their districting lines. Okay, back to the article. In January 10th, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court radically rewrote America's campaign finance laws to allow mega donors and corporations to combine unlimited sums, often in secret, to political action committees. Citizen United versus FEC decision gave wealthy donors unprecedented influence to buy elections, which Republicans quickly used to their political advantage. During the recall election between Weingart and Lehman in the summer of 2012, voters in Racine received a chilling mailer featuring a man grabbing a woman with his hand over her mouth. "You're not safe thanks to John Lehman," said the front of the mailer. The back illustration showed a man in a black hoodie with a line: home invasions, theft, homicide, do the crime, don't serve the time. The mailer, delivered to 10,000 homes in Racine, was authored by the Republican State Leadership Committee, which raised $30 million ahead of the 2010 elections and spent $1.1 million in Wisconsin alone. Thanks to the Citizen United decision, the RSLC could accept unlimited donations from corporate interests like Koch Industries and tobacco companies to attack Lehman for voting for a state budget that allowed felons to be released early for good behavior or health issues. With clear racial overtones, the mailer was sent just months after Trayvon Martin's murder in Florida. "It's the meanest mailer I've ever seen," said Lehman to the Huffington Post. So that's just one example of money basically overriding the will of the people in politics. Now, despite the Republican advantages, the end of 2017 brought good news for Democrats. In November, the party won the Virginia's governor race and picked up a surprising 15 seats in the state House of Delegates. And it should have been 16, but one of the seats was decided by pulling a name out of a bowl because a vote that had put her over the top was disallowed. Anyway, a month later, Doug Jones won a shocking upset over Roy Moore in a special election for the U.S. Senate in Alabama. Democrats are now favored to win control of the House in 2018 and have a shot at taking back the Senate. The tide is even turning in Wisconsin, where in early January 2018, Democrats won a special election by 10 points for a state Senate district that Trump won by 17 points and Republicans had held since 2000. It was the Democrats' 34th pickup for the 2018 cycle. And I'm going to read another article, what the effect of that was, but let me finish this one. The lower courts have already signed a willingness to push back on unfair redistricting. On January 9th, a federal court struck down North Carolina's U.S. House map, which gives Republicans a 10-3 advantage over Democrats. The first time a federal court has invalidated congressional lines for partisan gerrymandering. But on January 18th, the Supreme Court blocked the redrawing of North Carolina's maps pending appeal. GOP-drawn districts have also been struck down in Alabama, Florida, Virginia, and Texas. Many of these rulings are similarly being appealed by Republicans, making it unlikely such districts will be redrawn before the 2018 elections. After the story went to press, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the state's congressional maps, which give Republicans a 13-5 advantage, and ordered they be redrawn in 2018, boosting Democrats' prospects in the state. Even in the recent Democratic victories foreshadow some of the problems the party may face in 2018. In Alabama, Jones defeated Moore by 1.5%, but carried only one of 7 congressional districts. In Virginia, Democratic candidates for the House of Delegates won 224,000 more votes than Republicans, but were still denied a majority. A Virginia-like result would produce few gains for Democrats in more heavily gerrymandered states like Wisconsin. Democrats need to win 57% of the statewide vote there, an almost impossible number to take back the state legislature in 2018, says Nicholas Stephanopoulos, a law professor at the University of Chicago. Nationally, Democrats must win the popular vote for the House of Representatives by 8 points to get a bare majority of seats. That might be doable given the unpopularity of Trump, but Democrats still worry about facing a rigged system. If you have a wave election in 2018, it's entirely possible Democrats could win a significant number of votes and not have the Congress that reflects the wave, says Holder. And that's not how democracy is supposed to work. Hanging in the balance are basic rights for millions of Americans: the right to vote, the right to fair representation, the right to not have elections auctioned to the highest bidder. Welcome to the 2018 election season. Okay, that's the end of the Rolling Stones article. But folks, as I stated earlier, Scott Walker has taken it upon himself to go a step further. Now, the picture you see there is the Republicans at a polling location and stating, "Vote here." And you see the people surrounding them, but there's a giant moat surrounding the voting location so that the people cannot vote because they can't get to the spot that they need to vote in. Okay, now I mentioned Scott Walker. Check this one out. Scott Walker is literally preventing Wisconsinites from voting. The Republican governor is refusing to call special elections to fill vacant seats as his allies attack nonpartisan oversight of elections. And we all knew something was up when Scott Walker first won election, and then he went after the unions. There was a recall election, but the recall election took place after the gerrymandering of the county lines, and there was massive, and I do mean massive, money that came in. But even so, how he won re-election after the recall is beyond me. And then when the citizens saw what the heck was going on, okay, as far as the restriction for their right to vote, this guy should have never made it past the third election that he won in a squeaker. But the article from The Nation basically reads as follows. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and his Republican allies have never been more enthusiastic about democracy. After grabbing power in the Republican wave election of 2010 with a massive boost from heavy spending by the Koch brothers and other out-of-state donors, they redrew legislative district lines to prevent competitive elections, enacting multiple measures that made it harder for Wisconsinites to vote, and dismantled the state government accountability board that used to provide nonpartisan oversight of elections and ethic issues. But it turned out that Walker and his cronies were just getting started on a project that in recent weeks has seen embattled Wisconsin Republicans upend new commissions that were supposed to promote fair elections and responsible governance, while the governor has refused to call elections to fill legislative vacancies in districts that might be won by Democrats. As the one-time Republican star who crashed and burned as a contender for the party's 2016 presidential nomination prepared to deliver his annual State of the State message, Republican state senators denied the confirmations of the directors of Wisconsin's Ethics and Elections Commissions, and Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzpatrick, a close ally of the governor, said he wanted to force out employees of the commissions who had participated in the investigations of Republican wrongdoing. After Walker's Republicans effectively voted to oust Ethics Commission administrators Brian Bell and Michael Haas and began talking about reclassifying positions at the commission as part of a partisan purge of nonpartisan oversight agencies, Democratic State Representative Jimmy Anderson blasted his Republican colleagues for undermining the integrity of our electoral process, as well as the vital role that these watchdogs play in regulating lobbying and campaign activity. Wisconsin has a long-standing tradition as a leader in nonpartisan election administration. Anderson is right, but nothing the legislature has done so undermines the integrity of the electoral process as what Walker is doing personally. The governor is deliberately denying Wisconsinites representation in the legislature by refusing to call special elections to fill open seats in the state assembly and the state senate. In doing so, he is rejecting the clear intent of Wisconsin statutes, which declare any vacancy in the office of state senator or representative to the assembly occurring before the second Tuesday in May in the year in which a regular election is held to fill that seat shall be filled as promptly as possible by special election. So that means if there's an election that's going to occur in November, but the seat becomes vacant before the second Tuesday in May, a special election is supposed to be held so that the people have representation until the next election. Okay, check this out now. Okay, so that would allow, let's say it occurred after the second Tuesday. So that basically meant that the people who were affected, if it occurred after the second Tuesday, would only be without representation for half of a year. Remember that. So what's up? It may be that Walker is refusing to schedule the special elections because he is scared. The results of special elections held last Tuesday were disastrous for Walker and his Republican allies. The party lost a state Senate seat in western Wisconsin's 10th district as a 20 Democratic advantage in January 2018, and the GOP came closer than anyone expected to losing an assembly seat in overwhelmingly Republican Washington County, where a Democrat won 43% of the vote. Even the governor admits the loss of the state Senate seat represents a wake-up call, and Senate Minority Leader Jennifer Schilling, Democrat from La Crosse, argues that Governor Walker is running scared and is playing politics with people's right to be represented in the state capitol. He is clearly feeling the heat and scrambling to boost lackluster polls and the Republican brand, but voters are wide awake and aren't buying it. It may be that Walker has run his campaign with massive infusions of money from outside Wisconsin, approved such extreme gerrymandering that the federal courts have intervened and backed restrictive voter ID laws, assaults on early voting, same-day registration, and a host of other assaults on voting rights. Really is as willing to sacrifice Wisconsin democracy on the altar of his many ambitions as his critics suggest. Whatever his reason, the fact remains that Walker has refused to call special elections to fill the seats of former state Senator Frank Lassay of De Prairie and former state Representative Keith Ripp of Lodi, a pair of Republicans who quit the legislature in December to take post with the governor's administration. The governor wants to leave those seats open until January 2019, denying tens of thousands of Wisconsinites representation for a full year. When the governor initially refused to call the special elections, his aides claimed it would be a waste of money to hold them because the legislature wouldn't be all that busy in 2018. But the state Senate has already been quite busy, as the assaults on the election and ethics commissions confirm. Some of the governor's defenders had imagined that he might find cover in an advantageous reading of the statute language that suggests vacancies after the close of the last regular floor period shall be filled only if a special session or extraordinary floor period of the legislature is called or a veto review period is scheduled during the remainder of the term. But legislators noted that Walker has already called for a special election to enact schemes that pick on people who need food stamps. Under pressure from legislative Democrats, Walker is also saying that he wants the legislature to take major steps to address the crisis that developed on the governor's watch at the Lincoln Hill School for Boys and the Cooper Lake School for Girls as part of an ambitious agenda to reform how Wisconsin incarcerates young people. In other words, the legislature already has a busy agenda for 2018, and it could get even busier as the year goes on. So Walker's excuse for leaving Wisconsinites without representation lacks even baseline credibility, and Democrats are calling on him, the governor, and Democrats are calling him on it. The governor's refusal to call special elections leaves the citizens of these districts without representation for over a year, said State Representative Gordon Hintz, the Democratic leader in the Wisconsin Assembly. That is unacceptable. Unacceptable, and even in these times of so many assaults on voting rights, stunningly anti-democratic. This is criminal, and what they need to do, they need to haul his ass into court and have him show cause as to why he is refusing to follow the statutes of the state of Wisconsin by holding these special elections. But folks, put these together. You got gerrymandering, which dilutes the strength of Democratic voters. This dilutes the strength of all voters, but if you happen to be in a majority, you're fine. You have all of the voter ID laws that restrict the rights of people of color, black people in particular, to vote. And this is basically in most of the countries that have had lawsuits where these statutes have been declared unconstitutional. And now you have a guy who specifically said you could have everything that you need in order to vote, but guess what? You're still not getting representation because I'm not calling a special election. So you are going to have taxation without representation, because you damn sure know that in those two counties or elective districts that people are still paying their income taxes and their property taxes and all of the other levies that the state has placed on them. So we had a revolution in 1776 behind taxation without representation. And it looks like Mr. Scott Walker is doing the same thing. You people in Wisconsin, you need to create your own revolution. I'm not saying take up arms and go storm the State House. I'm talking about doing everything you can, okay, no matter what the obstacles are in front of you, in order to get to those voting areas, voting polls, and vote. And yeah, I recognize the gerrymandering part, but you potentially have an ally with the court system as they are declaring the redrawn voting lines to be unconstitutional and ordering that they be redrawn. Now, the delaying tactic is obviously that they, a lot of these states, Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin, are appealing these to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is not going to rule on this until June, which more than likely will not be enough time in order to get the lines properly redrawn. But they will be withdrawn sometime in 2018, more than likely, again, after the election. Once they're redrawn, do not lose the faith. Hang in there. 2020 is coming, and these same people that are up in 2018, House of Representatives in Congress, and your local state House of Representatives and state Senate people, possibly not the state Senate people, but the state House of Representative people, will be up in 2020. It will be at that point that you should have the firm ability to have your voice heard, kick these assholes out of office, and get back to representative government, which is what this is supposed to be all about. Anyway, that's pretty long, but hopefully informative. And again, this is not just happening in Wisconsin. This is happening in a lot of places across the country. Texas tried it, and they got kicked to the curb by their own state legislature. I'm sorry, by their own state Supreme Court. They were told that they couldn't get away with it. North Carolina, same situation. Alabama, I believe, also, and also in Georgia. But again, I did a video on this, and there are at least 10 to 16 states where this is going down. Not all of them are Republican states. I point to you Illinois and Maryland. And Maryland, to be honest with you, for the Democrats, they apparently learned something from the Republicans, because they really did a job as far as gerrymandering is concerned. And if it's not good as far as the Democrats are concerned, then it shouldn't be used against the Republicans as well. So fair is fair. We need fair, open, and honest elections. We need to get money out of politics. They need to shorten the election period. Like the United Kingdom, their presidential election period is only 90 days. That's all it is, 90 days. We go out damn near, we go out for sure a year, and damn near 2 years in most instances. We need to make sure that money is out of politics, okay? We need to get the Koch brothers and people of their ilk out of politics. We need not to allow them to contribute all this money to these PACs. We need to make these political action groups illegal, okay? So that you raise money like Bernie Sanders did. If people want to contribute, you take contributions from the people only, not from corporations, not from PACs, okay? A billionaire should be able to contribute exactly the same amount as a regular citizen, and vice versa. A regular citizen should be able to contribute the same dollar amount, or have his contribution limited to the same dollar amount, and a billionaire should have his contribution limited to the same dollar amount. $2,700 sounds pretty much right to me, but then that would cripple all of TV money that is being generated, all of the ads, all of that stuff would go by the wayside. But I believe we would be all better off for it.